Ever since students of color became the majority in the Minneapolis school system, it's changed the profile of education in Minneapolis.
You have the white kids who do extremely well. A lot of their schools have been seen as some of the best in the country. And then you have schools, especially like on the north side of Minneapolis, that are mostly kids of color, mostly African American, but also very poor. And so those disparities are really huge.
American Indian students have some of the worst educational outcomes of any group in the system.
Education issue of all was huge in the Somali community. Back 2002, Minneapolis public schools, without consultation with the community, they shut down almost every bilingual Somali schools. They lay off all Minneapolis Somali bilingual teachers.
Enrollment in Minneapolis had declined by 10,000 students over a decade. And so there was this need to relook at the city and to relook at where our schools were, what our transportation looked like.
We brought this different perspective that when we call this the achievement gap, it's really a misnomer, because we're talking about kids who are in the position they're in today because the system is not working, because there are systemic barriers, there's structural racism, institutional racism that is preventing our kids, low-income kids, kids of color, from having the same kind of opportunities that they need to be educational successful as the more affluent white families have. And so we kind of changed the dialogue from the very first day.
The Education Equity Organizing Collaborative came about just to kind of talk as communities of color who were pitted against one another in Minneapolis public schools, and then also to dispel the myths about each community and to see what actually united us.
In the spring of 2008, the school board announced that they were going to put a school referendum on the November ballot, and Minneapolis voters would vote yes or no whether or not to increase millions of dollars for the school system.
When they found that communities of color were not going to vote for the referendum, they're like, oh, let's go to the EEOC. They're groups of color, they have relationships, and ask them to support it.
And the Education Equity Organizing Collaborative resoundingly said, whoa, in order for us to support this, we need to know what's the impact on students, students of color, American Indian students. So the Education Equity Organizing Collaborative commissioned the Organizing Apprenticeship Project to conduct the analysis.
What we found from that analysis was that while most of the proposals contained in the referendum would not dramatically improve outcomes for students of color, we did find that if those proposals were not implemented, things would actually get worse.
Then we organize our communities, we knock the doors, we talk to the people, we rallies, town hall meetings. Finally, the referendum passed overwhelmingly, especially the locations and the neighborhoods where the most immigrants live, especially the Somalis. Almost 85% of Somali community who live in the city of Minneapolis vote yes to pass that referendum.
Communities of color were the major tipping point for it passing. And so that was the first time a racial equity impact assessment was done, and you could see that it made visible what the impacts would be, and it helped to get broader support.
And I would say that that's probably the first referendum where the vote of people of color really counted.
There's this way of policy making in the country where it's see no race, hear no race, speak no race. This form of policy making, it actually ends up reinforcing the biases that we have. So the racial equity impact assessment is a way to counteract implicit bias. It's like a careful consideration of the impact that a decision is going to have. I can break it down for you. REIA. So the racial is race, so we want to be explicit but not exclusive around the racial dynamics. Equity is about, again, this principle of fairness, justice. Right. Impact, we want to go beyond just in talking about intentions of policy, but actually look at the outcomes of our public policies and decisions. And then assessment, this is where you can generate options for moving forward, so we can be proactive about how do we create decisions that actually reduce the amount of harm. And then reducing racial disparities is part of that. Now we're in spring of 2009. We came up with a pocket guide to budget equity. It's a pocket guide of 5 questions that any decision maker at any level, say you're at the state level, county level, city level, metropolitan area level of decision making, you're about to make a big decision, you can dig into your pocket, whip out the pocket guide with 5 assessment questions and help to make sure equity is at the forefront of decision making.
In 2009, the school district forwarded a proposal to change the boundaries of the schools within Minneapolis Public Schools. And they felt that the costs of transportation were basically beyond their means and extraordinary. And so what they were trying to do was to find a proposal that would not only cut their busing costs for students, but also accommodate the growing diversity within the Minneapolis school population.
The Minneapolis School Board, again, now they're successful. They have this new ballot initiative. There's one. They came to the Education Equity Organizing Collaborative again and said, okay, we've got this Changing School Options initiative, and we'd love for you to support it.
Our response as the EEOC was, no, the district has to learn how to do this. They have to institutionalize this practice. We will help, but you need to take responsibility for doing this.
So enter the pocket guide, the five questions to budget equity. So we briefed the school board on the pocket guide, said if you were to do a racial equity impact assessment, here's some core questions that can help you get started. And that's where it took off from there. They actually did a racial equity impact assessment on Changing School Options initiative.
So then the district staff did that with our assistance. And actually what ended up happening was a different recommendation than had originally been proposed by school administration was adopted by the board.
That's the beauty of a racial equity impact assessment. It allows systems, institutions to generate options where they can consider the potential impact of a decision. Before it's made, you can weigh the options of what kind of impact this will have on racial and economic disparities. What kind of impact will it have on racial, cultural, economic communities? And so with the racial equity impact assessment on Changing School Options, they were able to pick the one option that would have the least amount of harm on racial and cultural communities.
What we found through that process was that there were 2 communities that were going to be disparately impacted by the options. One was the American Indian community, where it would affect about 34% of our kids. In other words, their education would be disrupted because they would have to change schools. And also the Somali community.
There were some schools proposed to shut down, but after we negotiate, after we bring their attention about the race, the school board decided not to close those schools. Now, when it comes also hiring the right people in the right places, now we have a good number of Somali teachers and leaders who working in the public schools. We have seen many times the superintendents coming to where the community live and listen to them, what's their interest and how they think we're gonna be good for Minneapolis public schools to be run.
And so the Somali community was able to work with the school district to keep a school open, Pratt School, where a lot of Somali kids attended, and they were able to negotiate with the district to do that. And in the American Indian community, it meant a lot of our kids were going to be moved from what had been our home school. And so what the district did in our case was they said, for those Indian families who maybe have 3 or 4 kids in the home school and they would be moved and suffer a high level of disruption, what we will do is we will individually sit down with those families and work something out. If they decide they want to stay in their home school, we'll allow them to do that. Otherwise, we'll transition them effectively over to their new school setting. So it was a much better solution than if we hadn't had any of this information. We wouldn't have been able to do any of the outreach to community. Community would not have had a voice in the solution. And so it was a much better policy as a result of taking the time to do the racial and economic impact assessment.
Being able to talk about the impact of these large aggregate school changes, district-wide changes, down very specifically about what is happening to cultural groups within the school system was essential. And, the assessment really got us to change, how we did business.
So Minneapolis has a long way to go, but the change in school options actually was a power shift on how communities of color are engaged around racial justice and racial disparities in Minneapolis. Because of the success of the racial equity impact assessment and the relationships and the organizing that has happened, it allowed us to build upon that.
We were finally able this past October to get the school board to adopt a race and diversity policy that requires that a racial and economic impact assessment be conducted as part of all policymaking. So it's truly institutionalized now.
It is important to have it systemically institutionalized because you want something that's going to be sustainable. You want something that looks at the problem of the disparities within Minneapolis public schools as a whole.
One key lesson is that we can counteract implicit bias when we consider the racial, economic, and cultural dynamics of policy. And we've seen it done at the school level, and this raises all sorts of possibilities for other systems to use this process, use the tool to help reduce disparities and make sure communities most impacted by the decisions are meaningful involved in the process.
I think what we've learned is how much power we really have within our communities when we come together, that we really can influence policy in Minneapolis. And I think it's also how much education there is to be done around issues of equity. Even though we have the policy that they have to do this assessment, what we say when we say the assessment and what we mean is very different than I think what the district thinks of. So there's some more education, some more conversation, and kind of consensus building that has to occur around the whole concept. So the work of equity is a long road.